When a country faces a nuclear threat, the basic idea is that you need nuclear weapons to deter nuclear weapons. But since all of America's nuclear weapons are far away in the continental United States, their ability to deter North Korea might be weakened. Based on this logic, one of the ideas repeatedly raised in South Korea has been to bring U.S. nuclear weapons back to the Korean Peninsula. Because the U.S. keeps about 100 nuclear weapons forward deployed in Europe, some South Koreans argue that the U.S. should take similar steps in Korea. During the Cold War, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union placed many nuclear weapons in the territory of their allies to strengthen deterrence. The U.S. deployed nuclear weapons to South Korea from 1958 until they were withdrawn in 1991 under an agreement with the Soviet Union. At one point, the U.S. had as many as 950 warheads in various forms: artillery shells, landmines, missiles, and bombs for aircraft stationed in Korea. However, the U.S. has never given an official response to South Korean calls for redeployment. Washington is thought to oppose the idea because it would provoke not only North Korea but also China and Russia, and because it believes the current nuclear umbrella based on U.S. homeland-based weapons is sufficient. So even though South Korean politicians and intellectuals have kept pushing for it, just like they push for South Korea's own nuclear weapons, nothing has moved forward. Some South Korean scholars argue that if deploying nuclear weapons in South Korea is too difficult, the U.S. should at least deploy them to Guam, a U.S. territory in the Western Pacific. Others suggest taking America's retired tactical nuclear weapons, refurbishing them for possible use, storing them in the U.S., and then transferring them to South Korea only if the North Korean nuclear threat becomes extremely serious. But the U.S. has shown no interest in any of these ideas either. Even if the U.S. were to forward deploy nuclear weapons to Guam or South Korea, as it did in the Cold War, that alone would not be enough. In the end, the U.S. president still has to make the final decision to use them, and he must be willing to risk a North Korean nuclear strike on the United States in retaliation. With that, the deterrence effect is still limited. For forward deployment to really work, South Korea needs to be involved in the decision-making process. In NATO, this is called nuclear sharing. Even though the U.S. president has the final say over the roughly 100 nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, NATO members participate through the Nuclear Planning Group. This makes them to exercise their right of self-defense and strengthens deterrence. Even limited South Korean participation in decisions about nuclear use would share responsibility with the U.S. president and make North Korea more cautious, since the chance of U.S. nuclear retaliation would appear higher. But unlike during the Cold War, it would not be easy for the U.S. to deploy nuclear weapons to South Korea today. Neighboring countries of South Korea would oppose it, and even inside South Korea, some people would protest. In December 2022, when members of South Korea's Conservative Party discussed strengthening an airport on Jeju Island, the far southern island of South Korea, so that U.S. nuclear weapons could be deployed there, Jeju residents and progressive groups fiercely opposed the idea, saying it would turn South Korea into a nuclear battlefield. Considering this reality, the author has argued, through multiple articles and books, that a better approach would be to station at least one U.S. nuclear submarine near the Korean peninsula and allow South Korea to take part in controlling the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, especially lower-yield warheads such as the 5-kiloton W-76-2. The East Sea of North Korea is only about 150 kilometers from Pyongyang, so basing a nuclear submarine there would be a major threat to North Korea. If South Korea could, at least partially, exercise its right of self-defense by participating in decisions to launch an SLBM, the deterrent effect would be extremely strong. If North Korea's nuclear threat gets even worse, the U.S. could deploy nuclear weapons to Guam and station South Korean and Japanese aircraft there for nuclear strike missions, creating a NATO-style nuclear sharing system based in Guam. Guam is only about 3,400 kilometers from North Korea. If South Korean and Japanese aircraft were standing by there for nuclear missions, North Korea would find it much harder to decide to attack South Korea with nuclear weapons. The U.S. government has not discussed any of these measures. This contrasts sharply with Russia's behavior towards its allies. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Belarus claimed it felt threatened by NATO and requested Russian nuclear deployment. After about a year of discussion, Russia placed nuclear missiles and bombs on Belarusian territory. The US did not even express serious concern, and European opposition was mild. In short, Russia easily did something the US does not even consider for its own allies. Deterrence and winning a war requires preparing for all possible scenarios, which demands heavy costs and a safety margin. For nuclear deterrence and nuclear warfare, the requirements for the cost and safety margin are even greater. America's nuclear umbrella may appear sufficient until North Korea actually threatens to use nuclear weapons to attack and absorb South Korea, but deterrence can fail overnight. Relying only on the promise of the U.S. nuclear umbrella without pursuing forward deployment or new nuclear sharing arrangements is a complacent response from the U.S. As the threat grows, countermeasures must grow as well. For more details on this nuclear sharing proposal, see Chapter 7 of the author's book, Nuclear North Korea: Armed, Desperate, and Unpredictable. If you'd like to hear more related content, please click the subscribe button.